Thanks everybody for coming out. This is Dr. Wood, who presented this information to us to the CCHD committee 2 meetings ago. And I thought that the information was addresses one of the key concerns that many bishops have about the work that CCHD does, and the research also, I believe, provides some strong data as we explore the impact of the Catholic Church being involved in society and the issues that we oftentimes get caught up in terms of the theological or ethical questions of moral cooperation and how to participate and how not to participate. That here, I think that we have a treasure trove of information that does help us understand from a sociological framework some of those issues. So I do believe that this is a very timely topic, and I do very much appreciate Rich Woods coming and making this presentation available to more of the bishops. But to provide perhaps just a little bit more of an introduction to what we are going to do, I am going to ask Ralph McLeod to say a few more words of introduction and speak on behalf of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. So, Ralph.
Thank you, Bishop. And before a formal introduction of Dr. Wood, I've been asked to say just a couple of words regarding the progress of the Review and Renew for the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. As you will recall, the bishops who oversee CCHD undertook a serious and very substantial review of their work. There were some concerns, as you might remember, as well as the occasion of the 40th anniversary. It seemed appropriate to have a very exhaustive review of the operations, activities, and procedures of CCHD. There was a desire to review and strengthen CCHD's policies, practices, and tools, and to build on those principles in a way that was respectful of Catholic teaching and to highlight some of the strengths of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. There was a call to see how CCHD might be more faithful, more effective, and more accountable as it carries out a very unique mission in the Catholic Church. A bishop's work group was appointed and worked diligently and met frequently, consulting with moral theologians and experts in grant-making and charitable giving. The CCHD work group communicated very often with bishops on several occasions, reporting on those directions of the review and seeking their input and suggestions. Meetings were held with the work group in regional meetings. USCCB staff, special emphasis was had when meeting with the USCCB Communications Department, Pro-Life, and National Collections Departments. Bishops were asked for input to help guide these deliberations and regional meetings prior to the General Assembly. I will just share with you some of the progress that we've made thus far. And to summarize this 9-month effort, I think it probably would work out best to put it in 3 different categories. The first, to reaffirm CCHD's Catholic foundations and its priority for the poor. How we might best increase Catholic participation. So CCHD staff has sought out non-traditional partners to work with and where possible eliminate past barriers that have prohibited that sort of work. For example, removal of language that prohibited funding ecclesial bodies, including voluntary poor and calculations towards poverty numbers, etc. For the purposes of accessing participation and decision-making by most of those who are affected by poverty, CCHD now considers priests and religious who primarily serve low-income people, parishes, and communities, and who live in solidarity with their people in these communities as contributing to the goal and the calculations. These efforts have yielded, again, non-traditional partnerships with state Catholic conferences, Catholic charities agencies across the country, St. Vincent de Paul, and increased funding groups sensitivity to working with Catholic parishes and partners. The strategic national grants have called for a new way of funding anti-poverty efforts on a broader geographic scale. The direct involvement of Catholic leaders and clergy, parishes, and other institutions is considered a significant positive factor and advantage in the review of applications of CCHD funding. CCHD organizations now receive priority consideration as long as they effectively carry out CCHD's mission and clearly reflect CCHD's foundations. Second, CCHD responding to the claims about some of their policies. CCHD worked with the USCCB General Counsel Office to revise and refine the CCHD grant agreements for greater clarity, consistency, and effectiveness. Within the grant agreement itself, grantees are now asked not to actively participate in activities that violate Catholic social teaching. We put similar language in pre-applications, applications, on a very explicit in site visits and conversations with prospective grantees. We've established an ongoing consulting relationship with moral theologian Father J. Daniel Mendling, who brings his expertise on cooperation and advises the CCHD subcommittee, national staff, diocesan bishops, and CCHD diocesan directors on the appropriate application of traditional moral principles of cooperation and collaboration. And third, explore ways we might be able to share the good news about CCHD. Finally, we were asked to look at improved ways that we might be able to share that good news. So we're doing that in several ways. We continually work with the National Collections Office, and that helps us in the promotion of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. Additionally, CCHD created a new position who focuses on promoting, safeguarding, and monitoring the Catholic identity of CCHD and helps with the compliance with CCHD requirements. The position was funded by reallocating existing resources within the USCCB, and the positions were filled by two different people. Gloria Luna Moorman initially, and now Dylan Corbett staffed this position and continue to promote CCHD through media, social media, and embedded in the conference's communication strategy. An increased positive web presence is obvious for CCHD-funded groups. Dioceses and other positive activities are featured on several websites and throughout the web associated with CCHD funding activities. After a several-year absence, CCHD has restored the practice of regular and systematic training and skill development for CCHD diocesan directors. This formation and training now focuses on how CCHD directors can better assist bishops, appropriately encourage applicants, evaluate grant applications and proposals, understand and communicate CCHD's mission and moral foundations, and monitor compliance with CCHD's requirements and grant agreements. This ongoing training will include CCHD's mission and foundations as well as basic ethical discernment. Since this reinstatement, CCHD has trained approximately 75 diocesan directors. Finally, there was a desire to express solidarity with the poor. Over the last few months, Justice, Peace, and Human Development has shared reflections on different aspects of the present economic crisis. They are meant to be a sign of our union with those who are suffering, a strong message of hope, and a challenge for all of us to look for solutions and assistance. While this is not an exhaustive list of the progress continues. And I must say that CCHD is now better understood by prospective grantees and is recovering the respect of many Catholics. It remains one of the most popular collections in the United States in the Catholic Church, and at its core addresses poverty in a very unique and essential way. We'll continue to work on the progress and continue to update you as the progress continues. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the Executive Director of Justice, Peace, and Human Development, Dr. Jonathan Reyes.
We'll get to the real show very quickly here, but I just want to set the stage for Richard, who's become a good friend over some time and some conversations about these issues that I've deeply enjoyed. Just in terms of context, when I've only been in the job for less than a year, so when I walked in, I came into a situation in which CCHD was under a certain amount of scrutiny in the middle of the renewal process, continuing to deal with a certain kind of criticism. And it's the good news that what Ralph summarized there very briefly is only the tip of the iceberg about how far CCHD has gone in its review and renewal process. Having said that, there's two things that stick in our mind as we talk about this at Justice, Peace, and Human Development. One is there's further to go. There's further to go. There's more we need to do. But here's the second, and I think this is the key, and this is where Richard's research is beginning to open doors in so many ways for us. The second point is this. The good news isn't just continuing to play defense. We've been playing defense for a while. We've been explaining certain things we do, and I'm sure that'll continue to be a piece of what we do. But there's a sense in the department, there's a sense in Ralph and in his leadership that it's time to start talking about CCHD for precisely the way in which it's responding to the challenges of the modern age. Founded 40 years ago, it was responding to particular challenges. But today, and I think we see this in the tremendous response to Pope Francis, which is a bit cliched to talk about, but nonetheless it's very real, that the kinds of things CCHD partners to do, which is going into communities, ending the great poverties of isolation, which as Benedict and Mother Teresa and more recently Francis have called the great cause of poverty, isolation, one of the great root causes, to go and build community, to help communities come into their own, is actually the right response today. It was the right response 40 years ago. It's the right response today for slightly different ways, because the modern inner city is a different dynamic. But nonetheless, it's where we ought to be, and we're convinced of that. So we think that the conversation now, buoyed with excellent scholarship, with continued theological reflection from the great advisors we have, and under the inspiration of Pope Francis, that we can start telling the good news in a way that's more than just giving commercials. It's actually showing the ways in which CCHD is precisely the right response to a poverty rooted in isolation, to the impact of globalization, to the breakdown of community and fundamental human relationships. And so the good news is, I think there's a gem here. There's a gem here. There's something we really want to say. So a while back, Richard was asked to engage through a partnership, but began engaging in some research. And the piece you're going to see today basically asks this question. Richard is not the kind of scholar who does commercials. So some people will ask a scholar to go do research that justifies their existence. Richard's a different kind of scholar, one might say an honest one. And he said, look, I tell you what I'll do. I'll look at the ways in which faith-based organizing intersects with the Catholic faith. I'll look at the ways in which the Catholic faith has impacted faith-based organizing. And I'm going to look at the ways in which organizing and faith-based activity has impacted the Catholic Church, and I'll tell you what I find. And this can be a baseline, a grounding, some empirical data from which to do some further thinking about this. The other thing, and so he's done that. And I think one of the things that emerges from this, I hope you see, is that the Catholic Church has a right to be heard in the modern world. In a time when the Catholic Church's voice is often combated and often seen as somewhat irrelevant, a lot of the work we do is actually earning us the right to be heard, and I think we should know that. The only other thing I'll say about Richard before I read just a piece of his bio is he said, do I dare be like a little provocative? And we said, absolutely. So we're hoping, really, the fruit of this presentation is conversation. We really want to understand better, how do we understand this work we're in? How do we portray it to the faithful? How do we portray it to the broader world? What questions haven't we asked about it? Which questions do we need to ask about it? So that's why we wanted a special meeting with the bishops here to do that. Richard Wood is the Associate Professor of Sociology and founding director of the Southwest Institute on Religion, Culture, and Society at the University of New Mexico. His research focuses on the cultural and institutional underpinnings of democracy, especially those rooted in faith communities. In 2003, his book on faith-based community organizing in poor urban settings, Faith in Action, was named Outstanding Book in Sociology of Religion by the American Sociological Association. Biography goes on with a number of publications. It's worth noting that in Richard we actually have probably the premier scholar in the area of faith-based research and in understanding faith-based community organizing, a man who deeply loves Jesus Christ and our Lord, and so he brings precisely the kind of perspective we need to move forward. We're deeply grateful to have you with us, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's great to be here with you. Buenas tardes. I think in starting, I want to not start with the slides, but tell you where I'm going. And I'm going to throw some numbers up in front of you, but really what those numbers do is give you a snapshot of Catholic involvement in faith-based organizing today and tell you a story about how that involvement has changed over 10 years. And in doing that, as long as Jonathan has accused me of being provocative, which this has been a great dialogue and a great conversation in the last, it's been a year now. Let me locate what I'm about to say in sort of my reading of this moment in the church. I think Pope Francis's new voice is being misread as sort of part of this conflict between, is the church too conservative or too liberal, right? And sort of being read in political terrain as a struggle between progressives and conservatives in the Catholic Church or something. And I think that's to misread it. So I want to think about it as a different kind of a reading. And the language here might be a little provocative because it comes out of sociology, but it's fundamentally a theological and ecclesiological point. Sociologists talk about those religious traditions that are fundamentally church, right? What that means is fundamentally oriented towards reaching out to the whole community, the whole world, with an offer of salvation, engaging everybody, right? Versus those faith communities that are fundamentally sects or sectarian, which see only themselves as saved, only themselves as pure. And now that's often used as a caricature. The real point when sociologists talk about this is every faith community is sort of a mix of church and sect. And that it's the, what portion of each, how does the church position itself at any given moment? Because if you want to actually reform the world, you have to have a certain amount of sectarian quality. You have to create some tension with that world if you're going to move it in a new direction. At the same time, if you're a pure sect and have no real contact with the world beyond your own boundaries, you can't change the world because you have no actual contact. I think the way to read the Holy Father's positioning of the Church Universal over the last year is that he thinks it's positioned itself a little too far as a sect, a little too strongly sectarian a message, and wants to pull it back to a little bit more of a universal message, a little bit more of a fully church-oriented kind of a message. That's not you, right? You can be a left sectarian. This isn't about politics. You can be a left sectarian, you can be a right sectarian. It's about church, it's about ecclesiology, and the Holy Father's calling us all to a more full offer to all of salvation and a little bit less of a sectarian tone, is my reading. So let me invite you to reflect on that just as we walk through this. And what I'm going to do is present small bites of data. I know how overwhelming a bunch of data can be. So I'm going to present small bites of data on a terrain, and then pause, questions, comments, dialogue. And then present a few more small bites of data, and then some question and comment. Okay? So please bear with me. So first I'm going to just walk through what all the faith-based community organizations are in the United States, what their religious affiliations look like and the diversity of that, what the racial and ethnic composition looks like, what the funding for that looks like and how it's changed, and then what their organizing activities are, what their profile really looks like. And not do that sort of the overall picture, but really trying to focus at each step on the Catholic side of all of that. And what I'll do is I'll present this piece and stop and have some time for comments and dialogue, present this piece and have some time for comments and dialogue. And all this is based on it's not just a survey of a few organizations. We invited almost 200 organizations around the country that do faith-based organizing to respond to this. And we got a 94% response rate. Now, in sociology, that's phenomenal. So for the first time, literally for the first time, we can say something authoritative about what this field really looks like. And then we collected data both about the organization itself, about its member institutions, about its board members, and about its board members and its paid staff. And more than 4,000 member institutions, we'll see how many of those are Catholic in just a moment, almost 3,000 board members, and today almost a little over 600 paid staff out there. That's what the field looks like. The shading behind is how many Catholics, the percentage of Catholics in each county. The dots are the locations of all those 200 organizations around the country. And the size of the dots corresponds to how many member institutions there are. Most of those member institutions are churches. Okay. So I want to start by looking at how does the Catholic presence in this field correspond to certain characteristics of those faith-based organizations. So 2 measures of the Catholic presence. Is there any Catholic presence, right? Is there any Catholic parish involved? And then the number of Catholic parishes that are involved. So first, the number of Catholic congregations in the county. Does this just reflect how much Catholic presence there is in that county? In fact, it doesn't in terms of is there Catholic involvement. how many Catholic parishes are involved does reflect the number of Catholic congregations. If we need the light back on, please let us know. Albert? Okay. Secondly, the proportion of Catholic congregations in the county. That is, of all the churches and religious faith communities in the county, how many are Catholic? That doesn't correlate with Catholic involvement. So it's not just a story that this field reflects Catholic activity to the extent there's Catholics in the county. It's driven by other things, like if the director of the organization is Catholic, you tend to get more Catholic involvement. That's not too surprising. How many Catholic organizers there are involved tends to produce more Catholic involvement. The proportion of Catholic organizers and the number of Catholic organizers both drive that. Whether they got funding from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops also produces much more Catholic involvement, interestingly. And how much funding they received drives this as well. So a first glimpse of the way that the money that the bishops put into this kind of work actually does generate more Catholic parish involvement out there. The profile of religious affiliations here. This is the actual member congregations. About a quarter of the congregations involved are Catholic. The other two big groups are mainline Protestants and the historic Black Protestant churches. The board members, so each of these faith-based community organizations have boards made up of representatives of all those churches. More than a third, or about a third, of the board members are themselves Catholic. Of the paid organizers, it's still a little more. And of the directors, it's almost half the directors of these organizations around the country are themselves Catholic. Now, we'll see later how Catholic they are in terms of attendance at Mass, religiosity, do they read Scripture, but they identify themselves as Catholic. This slide looks at that same data, pictured a little differently, but now comparing the congregations that are members of this kind of work to what the overall profile of congregations out there in America look like. So in organizing, about a quarter, 27% of these are Catholic. What percentage of congregations in America are Catholic, do you think? I'll give you a hint, single digits. It's about 5% of congregations around America are Catholic. By far the biggest group of congregations are evangelicals and Pentecostal Protestants. They tend to be very uninvolved, right? Catholics are enormously overrepresented in this sense, partly the product of Catholic social teaching, Catholic presence in poorer areas, and funding by CCHD. Now this is going to be instead of a snapshot, a kind of story about change. In fact, Catholic parishes continue to be a huge group involved in this, but it's actually fallen. So the green is 2011, the orange is data from 1999. So in 1999, it was about 33% of member institutions were Catholic. Now it's down to 27%. The groups that have gained a lot, which at least I would read as a good thing, reaching out to new faith communities, engaging a wider set of faith communities in the past, are evangelical Protestants, Jewish synagogues, Unitarian churches, and Muslims. They're still only 1.5%, but before they were none. And this group, the Pentecostal charismatic groups, were completely unrepresented before. I think that's a really important outreach as well, given their presence in poor areas and the consonance with some parts of Catholic teaching as well. This is how many years an organization that was involved in 2011, a parish or a church, how many years had they been involved as of 2011. Notice that Catholic institutions are the most, have the greatest longevity of all member institutions out there. That's witness to the kind of faithful, consistent teaching from the bishops about the importance of this work. It's a product of the funding that the USCCB has put into it. That's produced long-term Catholic involvement in lots of places. This is the number of the overall around the country, how many Catholic board members there are. By far, Catholics are the best represented on these boards. This is the same data, but percentage of board members, again, about a third of all those 4,000 board members out there are Catholic. Again, a really significant Catholic presence in these organizations. And this looks at of those board members, how many are clergy. Let's interpret this for a minute. Whereas almost half of the Black Protestant board members are themselves clergy, in the Catholic world, it's only about a fifth. Now, is that good news or bad news? I think one can frame it both ways. Let me pitch that it may be really good news. In a church which at Vatican II taught the lay responsibility for presence in the world, taught the empowerment of lay people to transform the wider world. It may be a really good thing to have lots of lay Catholic involvement out there. It may also be good news for badly overworked Catholic pastors in some places to not have one more board meeting to go to, I suspect. On the other hand, one might want more of a Catholic pastoral presence in these organizations. One might want more of pastors out there sitting on these boards to help orient them and for the priest to be involved. But you can read it either way. We'll pause in just a second. So then this is the same data, percentage of board members that are clergy. Overall is the green, overall board members is the green, the percentage that are clergy is the orange. Just notice how different the Catholic profile is here, that there is a lot of lay Catholic presence out there. Okay, so let's pause for a second. And you want to pause now or you want to see the staff data and then pause? How about let's see the staff data real quick? Okay, this is still about a religious affiliation. Of the organizers, a little more than 40% are Catholic in 1999. That's declined, right? Among organizers, there's now about a third that are Catholic. We'll talk about the reasons for that in a minute. Among directors, 47% were Catholic in 1999. It's still close to that, but it's also declined. 43% are now Catholic. But still, 2 out of every 5, better than 2 out of every 5 of the top level staff in each of these organizations are Catholic out there. And then the relationship between Catholic involvement and actual religious practice. Where religious practice here was measured, how often do you pray? How often do you read scripture? How often do you attend worship services? So if the organization director were themselves highly religious, produce more Catholic member congregations. Then a series of other things. How often does that faith-based community organization pray when they open meetings, sing hymns and other things? I won't go through all the detail here, but the pattern is either it doesn't seem to matter or lots of correlation between how often people pray and whether there's any Catholic member congregations. Again, some evidence that Catholic involvement does produce a deeper sort of faith orientation, a better grounding in actual practice of faith as opposed to simply a Catholic veneer over the top of it. So let's talk about the racial ethnic composition here. This is a kind of typical gathering in a high school gym of a real diverse bunch of folks. I believe this was about getting sewage and potable water services into a poor colonia in southern New Mexico. So of all those organizations out there, what we have is data not on individual level race and ethnicity, but of the member parishes and other institutions, the dominant race ethnicity of each of those churches. So is the church majority white, majority Hispanic, majority African American? And they're about 46% majority white, about 13% majority Hispanic. Now we'll also talk about that majority of that 13% of Hispanics. Some of those are enormous Catholic parishes. So when they hold a gathering, you get a whole bunch of Latino Catholics out there, even though only 13% are Hispanic institutions. Okay. Of the board members, it's a similar profile, slight shift. Among paid organizers, it's again a similar profile, but thinner African American involvement among organizers and heavier Hispanic involvement among organizers. And among directors, a heavy shift towards white directors. This is actually a more diverse picture than was true 10 years ago, but it's still pretty heavily white. And yeah, indeed. The racial ethnic composition of the member institutions here, this is now going to compare the data from Catholics and others. We don't have good Catholic data from 1999. It just wasn't collected very cleanly to just look at Catholics separately. But in 2011, the white member institutions have grown, as we just saw. Among Catholics, now it's a little less white, but the big growth here is all the Latinos that Catholic parishes bring into this kind of work. Then this is the 1999 data. Sorry, this is data collected in 2011. So the parish had to still be involved in 2011. Of those institutions that joined in 1999 or earlier, so did your church get involved in organizing in 1999 and earlier, like Father Bob Admondson's parish, or did it join after 1999? Pardon me. So the top part is congregations that have been involved for a very long time. The bottom part is congregations that have joined in the last 14 years. Notice the shift. Of the older institutions, almost half of the congregations were Hispanic. Of the ones that joined since 1999, it drops down to 28% being Hispanic Catholic churches. That's where the big drop in Catholic participation has happened. It's Hispanic Catholic churches in particular that have fallen off the map in terms of new parishes joining this kind of work. And I think that's about kind of environment inside the church, and it's also about finances. So I wanted to at least briefly talk about immigrant representation given the profile of immigrants in the country and just how heavily represented Catholics are among them. On the left, that's a photograph out of the big Salvadoran parish in downtown Los Angeles, and I forget where the other photo's from. St. Thomas. Sorry? St. Thomas Apostle. Yeah, this is the one on the left, St. Thomas Apostol. The percentage of member institutions whose constituents are predominantly immigrants, so again, institutions, 13%. But again, some of those are these big booming Catholic churches of all immigrants, and so you get huge immigrant presence sometimes at the assemblies. Of those immigrants, better than 2/3 of them are Hispanic, but there's also important, especially from Africa and the Caribbean, and then from Southeast Asia, especially the Asia, or from the Philippines. And then immigrant representation within these groups. The green shows all the member institutions. The red shows just the Catholic ones. So again, of the Catholic parishes involved in this work, 30% are primarily immigrants. Of the Catholic board members involved in the work, better than a quarter are immigrants. Of the paid organizers, better than a fifth are immigrants. And of the directors, 10% are immigrants. Now being a director of one of these coalitions takes a remarkable combination of skills, right? These have to have really strong political skills, interpersonal skills, managerial skills, fundraising skills, ability to talk both about faith and about politics in fluent ways. That 1 out of 9 of these are themselves immigrants is an important channel of upward mobility in American society, I think. This compares the all immigrant congregations and then just the Catholic immigrant congregations. Most of those immigrant congregations are Hispanic Catholics again. These are all the organizations in the country. That's the 200. The ones that are addressing immigrant issues, interestingly, are not confined to the border areas, right? As immigrants have spread throughout the country, and as immigration is a hot political debate inside the society, these organizations are dealing with immigration all over the country. They're certainly heavily involved right now in comprehensive immigration reform, but a lot of them have been involved in state-level DREAM Act work or just in local work to provide better services to immigrants, or local work to try to get local police departments not to target immigrants aggressively. Now this slide is going to look at the impact of CCHD funding on whether these groups are working with immigrants, because CCHD has prioritized, and the USCCB has prioritized immigrant rights in the country. So this just shows those that receive CHD funding and those that did not receive CCHD funding. Notice that if you receive CCHD funding, you were much more likely to report yourself as being very involved with immigrants. But it's spread across all the groups. Want to do one more section, then a pause? Yeah, okay. Let's look at funding sources. So this is what the funding picture looked like in 1999. These organizations, in principle, try to spread their funding around internal dues collection, funding from CCHD, funding from other religious sources, and funding from secular groups. This is what it looked like in 1999. It's changed as of 2011. Proportion of CCHD funding has actually fallen. That's not mostly because CCHD funding has fallen nationally. It's because there is more money going into the field. Notice the fall in member dues as well. That may well be a product of the recession when this data was collected. And importantly, the new money going in from secular foundations and corporations. This fall has to do, I think, mostly, that other faith-based funding is mostly out of moderate and liberal Protestantism, and many of those denominations have faced real funding crises. This is of all the faith-based organizations out there, what percentage receive any money from CCHD. In 1993, it was 83% of them. In 2011, it's only 62% of them get any funding from CCHD. That's partly the product of the growth overall of the field. There's more of them out there. It's also a product of CCHD having made a decision to try to put more money in, put bigger grants. So instead of a small grant, trying to give more money and see better work around the country. But notice that policy decision doesn't get reflected in this data. When the directors reported how much money they received from CCHD, the amount hadn't changed. Interesting. Not quite sure what's going on there. And then the impact of funding from CCHD on organizing activity. This is a really interesting story. So the income composition of these organizations, again, typically in American society, all kinds of nonprofit organizations are dominated by the wealthy, dominated by high income, dominated by the highly educated, right? CCHD has a policy that says, if you're going to apply for funding from Catholic Campaign for Human Development, you have to have representation of poor people on your board. At least 50% of your board has to be relatively low income, right? That's an extraordinary policy in America. I don't know of any other organization that has that strong a policy, and it shows up here. This is FBCO board members. Notice the high representation at the lower end compared to what it looks like nationally. U.S. adults, it doesn't quite have as many of the truly poor as the wider U.S. population, but it has far more of the truly poor than most organizations have. And in these two categories, it overrepresents the U.S. population, and again, has vastly more poor, working class, and lower middle class folks than most organizations. This shows those that receive CCHD funding and those that didn't. Again, those that have CCHD funding have better representation among poor communities. Important product of your policies, I think. Next couple slides look at the primary issues these groups engage in. So we asked them, over the last 2 years, what issues have you worked on actively? Poverty is kind of a catch-all, right? Lots of what these groups do is work on poverty issues of some kind. In particular, education, healthcare, immigration, housing, criminal justice, employment wages. This went up enormously at the time of this study because of the big banking crisis. All the kinds of issues that Catholic social teaching on poverty in particular has emphasized. The other question, given the controversies out there, are these organizations involved in things they shouldn't be involved in, right, if they're receiving Catholic funding? We do have a little data on that. Tiny involvement in anything that at least, nothing about working on HIV/AIDS necessarily contradicts Catholic teaching, but it could, right? It's a terrain on which those violations might happen. Again, one could work against same-sex marriage. So we then asked, if you received funding, what does this look like? So again, those that received funding and those that did not, the red one showing the ones that got CCHD funding. Again, you get stronger representation on these issues if you have CCHD funding, and you end up with no or minimal representation down here if you're receiving CCHD funding. I think that's good news. All right. Pardon me. Onward? I know I'm throwing a bunch of data at you. We'll pause here in a minute. Okay, and then we asked, at what level are you addressing those issues? And kind of unsurprisingly, for immigration, healthcare, banking foreclosure, mostly it's done at the national level. That's where those debates are happening. But if you've been involved for a long time in this stuff, you know what a change this is. When I first started studying this, literally nobody was doing national level work on any of these issues. And yet, lots of the decisions that actually shape poverty in America aren't made in your local community. They're made at your state legislature. They're made in the national capital. So over the last 10 years, these organizations have begun to really try to project power at the state level and at the national level around things like immigrant rights and banking policy.